Hey everybody, good morning. How many of you are personally touched in one way or another by Alzheimer's? So just so many, and I'll put my hand up as well. I know there are a few of you who did not raise your hands, and I find that interesting. And I want to start just with George, with the group that you founded. I had the pleasure with your late wife and you being invited early on to some of the gatherings around the creation of your organization. Was so moved by this. And at that time, I didn't have really much exposure or connection. I have since. And this question of people who've had personal contact, I'd like to hear why you started your organization and have committed so much of your personal fortune to it. But I think the other question is, what do we do with the people who haven't yet had that personal connection and make them stakeholders in this as well? George?
Well, we started this organization in 2010 because my wife and I and two of our very close friends who'd been deeply affected by this disease were enormously frustrated by the seeming business as usual pace at which things were occurring. Everyone accepted the fact that, in fact, you could never get out of Congress asymmetrical increases in research investments in Alzheimer's. Everyone took for granted that it was impossible to collaborate among the 100 or more organizations in the country that had Alzheimer's in their title. And there seemed to be absolutely no strategy to change that state of affairs. We got angry because we had been affected by the disease, and so had the friends that started this very patient-centric organization. So we started with the politics. We started with a political action committee, the first Alzheimer's-only political action committee. We started as a C4 because we wanted to change attitudes of government. And we basically used a chart. It's not up here yet, but you'll see the global, this is the global analog to the chart that we used. You will see the second inconvenient truth of this century. If you track rise in CO2 levels, as Al Gore did, and you track the percent of the global population over 65, you get these curves, which are remarkably similar. And similarly, the cost is escalating at the same rate. So if you look at this globally, and Harry laid out the numbers domestically, you look at this globally, it is a massive disease affecting now 50 million people around the world, 150 million people with the disease by mid-century. So you get angry. Why isn't there a greater response to this calamitous occurrence that's going to create such massive human suffering around the world and in the United States? So we went after politics and said, look at this chart. You have to asymmetrically invest in this disease. We began an organization called Leaders Engaged in Alzheimer's Disease. Now it is 100 Alzheimer's serving organizations all collaborating around the politics of this disease. And we laid out then with the Global CEO Initiative, which we founded, which is a group of a coalition of companies, a strategy for how to accelerate medicines to markets. Not just funding basic research. How do you get an insight that occurs in an academic lab actually to market? There's a whole string of activities that have to occur in order for that to happen. So we developed a business plan, and now we've been executing both on the political plan and the business plan, and things have changed. Not going to say we did it alone. Indeed, our whole philosophy and the name of the organization, Us Against Alzheimer's, is that it's all of us. And it's everybody that needs to collaborate, but with leadership and direction and some strategy to do that. Right. So that's what we did. And the distinguishing characteristics of our organization, as you're going to hear in a minute, is that we basically went to what we thought were the most affected subpopulations in the country. Subpopulation, that's the most affected populations of our society, women and minorities. This is going to be a majority-minority disease by the 2030s. And so you're going to hear some of what makes us distinctive in that regard.
Just short form, you use the terms patient-centric to describe what you did as a distinguishing factor between what you're doing and how you saw much of the rest of the field. Just short form, what do you mean?
Patients, people, families.
But what does it mean in practical
It means that, in fact, we're neutral. We don't care who wins this race to get a drug to you guys. We want everybody to win. We don't care, quite frankly, who wins the Nobel Prize for discovering the cure to Alzheimer's. We want everybody to get the Nobel Prize. So what we're finding is that a neutral party that's motivated by the pain and suffering that is experienced from this disease is much more trusted in bringing people together across sectors, within a sector. So all the pharmas are in our coalition. All the sectors are in every strategy that we pursue.
So Jill, Stephanie, before we get into the question of like what's going on in the groups that you're working with, I want you to help me with a gap I feel in this discussion. And some materials I read, I don't know who won this prize, but somebody won the annual Brain Prize worth about £1 million or €1 million in this, which is even more than $1 million, whatever. So, and it said, this person said that the reason the Alzheimer's drug effort has failed so far is that drugs are delivered at a stage when the disease has already progressed too far. And he went on to say, in comments to the press, they expressed confidence about finding a successful drug within 5 years, and Alzheimer's will disappear as a major problem for society within a decade. That's a staggering comment from someone at a high level of research when, you know, I look at the people here, I look at the conversation, I look at what folks are investing in this, I look at the numbers that George has just shared and what we just heard from Harry, and I'm just saying, how do you link the confidence of that research? Is he or she just a nut? Or is there something promising in the world that you're looking at? How do you bridge those? Because one seems to be a heavier lift. The other is being said, hey, we're going to have this done and we won't even talk about this in 10 years. We'll all be out of, the Alzheimer's Association will be out of business.
I mean, I would just say I love the optimism, right? So
I hate optimism. Okay, I'm actually a cynic. I don't trust
You're just
these
a
people.
cynic?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
you know, I'm going to go with the optimism. My father's 89 years old, and I think he's 89 and living alone because he's optimistic.
Okay.
My mother's the one with Alzheimer's. You know, I would say this. I think we have started to understand the complexity of solving this problem, and we now have lots and lots of excellent researchers, not just working on one thing. We are working on risk reduction, we are working on prevention, we are working on understanding the need to take care of our brains in the way we take care of other parts of our bodies. We are starting to learn about the relationship between cardiovascular health, between anxiety and depression and other forms of illness that allow us to understand the progression potentially to MCI and then ultimately to Alzheimer's. So I think we have exploded in many ways so that the pathway is not one path. It's like a spider. And, you know, I can't comment on the 5-year optimistic prediction, but I do think that in the last 5 years, so what has happened in the last 5 years, the pathways have opened up in ways I think we couldn't have even predicted.
Is there a gendered, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would just add to that, you know, I'm optimistic because I think we have to demand nothing less than that. That has to be our outcome. We have to express it. We have to be focused on it. We have to disrupt Alzheimer's, which is a disease that is disrupting millions and millions of families, especially minority communities, African Americans, Latinos.
So it's almost like you need another chart, right, that shows if you get this right, here's what the cost dimensions would be in the future. So you have a dotted line that shows a different possibility, right?
But one of the things I think that's so encouraging as well is that, you know, the pathology, the brain pathology for Alzheimer's begins to show itself 20 years before the first symptom. So there's a wonderful opportunity in a window where we can begin to see the brain making changes, where if we find the right type of mechanism, we can actually, you might still have Alzheimer's, but you won't have any symptoms. And I think that's a wonderful outcome.
So what's going on in the African American community? I know we talked about minority communities, but I know you're working specifically to raise awareness, you know, build capacity, get folks connected. Is there something different about the African American community and how it's handling this than other communities?
I think what's different is that we're 13.6% of the population, and we are bearing over 33% of the national cost for the disease.
What do you mean bearing the cost? Meaning
the caregiving costs, which are what are the major cost drivers, are being paid for by essentially 13% of this population. We are twice as likely to get Alzheimer's disease as non-Hispanic white Americans. We are less likely to receive a diagnosis at all. And when we receive a diagnosis, often it is in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease. Because of past research atrocities, because of mistrust or lack of access to the medical system, because of lack of physician awareness. I go out and I ask people all the time when I'm in communities throughout the country, has your doctor ever talked to you about brain health? The terminology is not even out there. Has he ever done like a checkup from the neck up?
So it's a bias or a literacy issue?
I think it's both. And I think that's why it's a complex issue that we have to address. But I can tell you from my work out in communities with real people is that about 96% of the people, and we work with people pretty much 65 and older, and much older, have never had what we would consider a checkup from the neck up. We do that for children, You know, we ask about the development of children, and we have markers. The Academy of Pediatrics can tell us, you know, this is the trajectory that you want your child on, but we don't do something similar for people who are aging or people who are at high risk for developing Alzheimer's or other dementia.
And Jill, you deal with women, so I'd ask you the similar question. Is there a gender divide in awareness, capacity, in the way women are treated who are around this? And I happen to know George's wife, the only person I knew more intimidating than George. I loved her. I thought she was really great. She would tell me about how she would fund her brother's Wildly Left magazine, even though it wasn't your politics. I mean, I just loved her investment in life and engagement. So big hat tip to Trish. But in the gender dimensions of this, which I know Trish Vradenburg was so committed to, what's happening there? Why are you doing what you're doing?
Well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, a huge percentage of Stephanie's population and the Latino population are women. Women are 2/3 of the victims of this disease. We are predicted to be somewhere between 65 and 70% of the caregivers of this disease. So you do the math. So that's point number one. Point number two, you know, women, as we've learned in heart disease, are not smaller men. And so we need to understand sex-based differences and gender-based differences in this disease and in other diseases. It is not so that we promote women's health. If we understand sex-based differences, we actually understand health for everyone. And so we're really committed to promoting sex-based research and ensuring that we don't make this mistake that we've made in other places. I would say in my work today, most importantly, I think women make change and women listen. And women are the chief medical officers of their families. And so, you know, I was 40 with 3 young children when my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 10 years ago. And I was looking up and looking down. I was doing cognitive testing on my son with ADHD. I was doing cognitive testing on my son who plays serious lacrosse in concussion prevention. I was not thinking about my brain health at all, and I had not been thinking about my mother's brain health at all. This is an opportunity, and women think like that. They think up, they think down. And, you know, the point made earlier about millennials, you know, we are now in a point in our history where people want to know more about their health and the trajectory. So we're seeing the rise of things like 23andMe. I've had young people come up to me and say, oh, you know, I did 23andMe. Seems like I have one Alzheimer's gene. Not upset about it. You know, just like, oh, what should I do with this information? That's a moment, right? That's an opportunity to change how people think about this disease and ultimately catch people so that if we can reduce risk or prevent the disease in the 20 plus years before someone might actually have MCI or Alzheimer's, that's the moment.
Thank you for that. I know the three of you are engaged in awareness building, capacity, all the dimensions of research, but you're also engaged in shifting the political landscape, and George was very blunt about that. And I'm interested when I hear someone talking about the political landscape and wanting to change it. If you were to write a story for The Atlantic, who would your heroes be and who would your villains be? George?
Oh, this will be fun. Roy Blunt in the Senate.
Hero, I take it.
A champion of this in the Senate. He chairs the subcommittee on appropriations related to this particular area. He has been a champion, as Harry cited, the comparison of Defense Department budgets and the cost that he sees to society. He's the one that uses that metaphor or that comparison and says this is impossible. The government cannot sustain this. So either you're going to have to cut back the hell out of benefits or you've got to invest more in the cure. Any business executive who had a $280 billion cost problem as investing less than $1 billion to solve that would have been fired. So the federal government should be fired, right? Well, they're beginning to pay attention to that. In the House, it's a guy named Tom Cole, conservative out of Oklahoma. Same kind of experience. His father experienced Alzheimer's, but in fact, having seen the disease is not motivating him, and maybe it's emotionally motivating him, and politically, he's been very supportive. So those are my two champions on the congressional side. They really are. But there are untold numbers of people in agencies, in everyone, Medicare, FDA, NIH, who have personally experienced this disease and who are highly motivated to try and figure it out. The problem is not the motivation of the people in government. The problem is, what do I do? Because the NIH does one thing, the FDA does another thing, Medicare does a third thing, and by the way, none of them are going to develop a medicine. So that means industry has to be at the table. Well, that's terrific, but that also means that NGOs, patient-led organizations like ours, have got to be in there saying, hey, let's talk. Figure out what you're going to do, figure out what you're going to do, what you're going to do, what we're going to do, what the global CEO initiative is going to do, all of us working together. And by the way, no one's going to cure Alzheimer's in the United States without curing it around the world. Or put another way, if the innovation comes out of Europe or Asia, we want that in the United States. So this is a global effort. It's a global problem.
So heroes are nice, but who are the villains?
Yeah, I was going to challenge the premise. I'm going to challenge the premise of your question.
Oh, come on! There's always
which is, you know, we live in a divisive time, and it is extraordinary to work in this space. I'm going to mention some women. I'm going to mention Susan Collins. I'm going to mention Debbie Stabenow. I'm going to mention Linda Sanchez. I'm going to mention Maxine Waters. But I think what is so extraordinary, and George and I worked together in early days of the tech boom, really early days, and we were going into senators' offices and teaching them how to turn their computers on. 10 years ago, we were teaching people about Alzheimer's. We go in, it's hard to actually say, hey, we'd like you to co-sponsor the Change Act, which is our piece of legislation, because they stop us, and either the staff or the senator or the congressperson says, I need to tell you my story first. So I have them at hello, and that is a moment, right? It's an opportunity in a system of divisiveness that sort of thrives on it, where we're seeing enormous bipartisanship in the Senate, in the House, and as George articulated, all throughout the government. This isn't an issue we have to sell.
I said the villain in this piece is not a person; it is the priority setting in Washington and changing priorities. Because every time, this is my conservative speaking, every time you set a government program in place, there are a lot of people dependent on that program, and a lot of people who are then invested in the same priorities. And you say, no, I want to increase NIH spending. I want to increase investment in Alzheimer's. No one will disagree with that, but what they will disagree with, well, where do you get the money? And so the Democrats have tended to want to take it out of the military budgets, which has proved politically impossible. And the Republicans have been willing to shift money within the domestic discretionary budget, which is, with Republicans in control, possible, but no one will disagree about the need for additional investment. Everyone will disagree about what has to be cut in order to do that.
Stephanie, I'm going to ask you the same thing, who's the villain in the story, and I also want you to just, as we go to the audience in just a moment, is there a dimension to this? Because the Atlantic writes so much about racial division and inequality in the country. It's a big core theme of what we're doing. What is the dimension of that? What's the frame looking at that on that side? Is there racism built into this question from a health, even an attention perspective from Washington?
Lots of questions there. Let me answer.
Take your favorite.
I'll pick my favorite one. The most difficult one, I think, is the villain question, and not wanting to single out an individual. And I did spend most of my career on Capitol Hill. I would say the villain are complacent politicians who are unwilling to challenge funding priorities when it looks like it will disrupt some of their base and current stakeholders. So, for example, if I'm just doing a cost benefit and I'm looking at the different diseases, then we never liked the idea of pitting diseases against each other. But there are some diseases that have been disproportionately positively impacted with funding, and as a result, their numbers have gone down tremendously, which is it's a great success. It might be appropriate for us to look at that and to say, we are making great gains here. We can now move some of the resources that were going into that and apply it to a new and emerging and devastating disease, which is Alzheimer's. Politicians need to be willing to make that hard decision. And I don't see that willingness in Washington. We have a lot of people who are supporting the status quo.
What percentage of Congress fits that bill of complacency?
I would say at least 95%.
That's a bold and tweetable answer.
Okay, well, that's my perspective.
Thank you. Let me open up to the floor for questions, comments from some of you. I hear a shy crowd. I'm just going to go to you. Yeah, right here. Hey, how are you? What's your name? She's going to run a microphone over to you.
Sure, Jason with UsAgainstAlzheimer's. In terms of villains, what would you consider the healthcare system a villain? You talk about complacency, lack of prioritization. What role does the healthcare system play in acting as a barrier to effective treatments for this disease?
No question that this is the next area of disruption for us, because in fact primary care physicians do not know how to talk about the brain. They're afraid of discovering something that they then can't talk to, like cancer was in the 50s and 60s. And I think persons who go see their doctor do not ask about their brain. So this is one where, in fact, we're leading an initiative now led by, among others, these two people and you, basically to try and disrupt primary care practice in a way that will get people to ask about their brain health, get a checkup from the neck up, and have a doctor that knows how to respond to that. And as Harry pointed out earlier, there are now demonstrated ways in which one can reduce the path that you're going to go on to get to dementia. And so we need doctors to understand that and to build that into common practice, to make a checkup from the neck up as common and as routine and as understandable as a checkup from the neck down.
I would also answer in saying that, you know, our nation is not a prevention-focused nation. It is not really our culture. We go to the doctor when something ails us. Many of us don't go to the doctor every year for a, you know, let's just get a baseline, how we're doing here. And when you do that, the doctors only have about 15 minutes with you anyway. And as you get older, of course, you have the complexity of having multiple doctors. So I often share that my father has dementia. My mother is 85, he's 80. They're basically healthy. My dad has Alzheimer's, not Alzheimer's, he does have dementia. But my dad has diabetes. Mom has a little high blood pressure. So basically, for that age range, they're doing, I think, quite well. They have 17 doctors between the two of them.
Wow.
So it's a system that we're very specialty focused. We're not focused on you know, prevention strategies. So we do need some systemic changes and need to examine the way you know, medical care becomes much more complex when you get older. And you know, or if you have dementia, they don't want you driving. Well, you've got these 17 different doctors, and there's no coordination. You've got all these different medicines. We don't know which ones work positively or negatively. You've got these huge caregiving burden. So in the African American community, you know, we have this huge care problem. You've got people who, frankly, we are benefiting finally from all the civil rights action of the 60s. You've got generations who are beginning to accumulate wealth, only to have it disrupted by Alzheimer's, where you're having to make this difficult choice and of putting your family member in out-of-home care, which is not what I've seen in my community to be preferred, or reducing your hours, losing productivity, or stepping out of your employment.
Right. Other questions, comments? Yes, right here. Hello.
Hello, Steve. Lyric Hughes-Hale with EconView. And my question is, given the difficulties in diagnosis, given our primitive understanding of how the brain works, why just focus on Alzheimer's? Why not focus on the full range of neurodegenerative diseases, since probably there's a common thread between them? Thank you.
Well, I would say that we are focusing on Alzheimer's. That's what's affected us. But clearly Michael J. Fox and others are focused on Parkinson's. Increasingly, there is now the way that we're working with government. There's Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. That means frontal temporal lobe dementia, Lewy body dementia, and cardiovascular involved dementia, as well as Parkinson's, ALS, and MS. So the answer is, you can diffuse your efforts and focus on the larger set, but then exactly what's the investment strategy and what is it? It is, I think, because we as individuals and families have been affected by something that's been labeled Alzheimer's, and somebody else has been affected by something that's been labeled Parkinson's, that we tend to focus on that as families and communities. With that said, scientists are discovering at the basic level that there may be some commonalities in terms of the original origin of some of these diseases. And so we're seeing in basic research some interesting thinking about what may be common origin stories to all these diseases. And of course, we would support research along that line, because to the extent you learn something in Parkinson's that may be applicable to Alzheimer's, terrific. So, but we happen to have been affected by Alzheimer's.
Well, and I think sort of what Stephanie brought up about changing our culture to a culture of health and prevention. I mean, when we get when we flip that on its head, which is what we're trying to do with our brain health initiative, we want people to care for their brains and understand where they are cognitively at much earlier times in their lifespan. And so we will, in fact, not necessarily from a diagnostic perspective, but from a detection perspective, really start to understand in a much more nuanced way. At least that is the goal of the initiative, to change the conversation around brain health. The other thing that I would say, which sort of gets to the question of where are the barriers in our system, and that is the way our National Institutes of Health is set up with institutes.
Right.
So as we begin to think about research, really innovative research that tries to connect the dots between anxiety and depression, so mental health and cardiovascular health, and Alzheimer's disease, which comes out of the National Institute on Aging,
right.
we have a significant barrier in terms of people who are making funding decisions to
right.
essentially allow us to really bore in and answer some of those really important questions.
Stephanie, I've got to wrap up. I don't want to give you the last word.
Well, I'm very excited to be working in this space. I spend a lot of time, as I said, out in communities talking to people. Alzheimer's is the most feared disease in America. And it's not something that we can wait on or hope that there will be some type of a redirection. We can see the age boom. It's coming. It's coming fast and furious. We need to plan effectively, and we absolutely need to demand a cure.
Well, with that, though I'm a profound cynic, I very much hope we're not talking about this in 10 years and that the researcher solved it all. So let's give a round of applause to Jill Lesser, President of Women Against Alzheimer's, Stephanie Monroe, Executive Director of African Americans Against Alzheimer's, and of course, George Vradenburg, co-founders of Us Against Alzheimer's. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.